I want to start by telling you something I believed for most of my life. The ground doesn't lie. That's not a saying where I come from. It's not something people put on walls or repeat to sound wise. It's a working principle, a survival principle. You read the ground, and the ground tells you what passed through, how long ago, how heavy, how fast, which direction it was going. The ground is a record. It doesn't have a reason to deceive you. I believed that for 63 years. Something changed my mind. I've thought a long time about whether to say any of this. There are people I respected deeply, people who are gone now, who believed certain things should stay inside the community. Not out of shame, not out of superstition, the way outsiders sometimes assume, but because there's a protocol to these things, a reason the old knowledge was passed down quietly, person to person, not broadcast. And I honored that for a long time. But I'm old now. The ones who carry those rules with them, most of them are in the ground themselves. And I've watched what happens when the warnings disappear with the people who held them. I've watched younger people go into places they shouldn't go without knowing what their grandparents knew. And I've decided that silence, at this point, is the more dangerous choice. So I'm speaking. Not to frighten anyone. To correct something that was left incomplete. There are things in the deep wilderness of this state that the maps don't account for. I want you to understand what one of them showed me, and I want you to understand what to do if you ever see the same sign, because there is a right response and a wrong one, and the wrong one has consequences I don't think most people are prepared for. Now, let me go back to where this starts. I grew up in interior Alaska, in a small community that most people outside the state have never heard of and couldn't find without help.
My family had lived in that region for generations, not in the romantic, abstract sense that word sometimes gets used, but concretely. We knew that land the way you know the layout of a house you were born in. We knew where the ice thinned in February, where the moose moved in late fall, where the wind changed direction without warning near the eastern ridge, and what that change meant. That knowledge wasn't academic. It kept people alive through winters that had no interest in whether you survived them. My grandfather taught me to track when I was young enough that I can't remember learning it. It's just something I've always known how to do. By the time I was 12, I could age a track in snow to within a few hours. I could tell you whether an animal was moving at a walk or a trot, based on the pressure distribution in its prints. I could tell you if something was injured by the way it was shifting weight. Reading the ground was as natural to me as reading a face. You look at it, and it tells you things. I say all of this not to impress anyone. I say it because I need you to understand what it means that what I found didn't make sense. I wasn't inexperienced. I wasn't frightened easily. I had spent years in the wilderness alone and never once felt anything I would describe as irrational fear. When I tell you that what I saw in the snow that morning sat wrong in my mind from the first second I looked at it, that means something. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't unfamiliarity. It was the opposite. It was the feeling of someone who reads a language fluently, suddenly finding a sentence that cannot exist. This happened in late November. I was in my early 30s. My nephew, my sister's boy, 19 at the time, had come with me for a trapping run we did most years that season. We'd made camp about 2 hours from a nearest road, in a stretch of spruce and birch that we knew well. First night was quiet.
Temperature dropped hard after dark, maybe 30 below by morning, and when I came out of the tent just before first light, I did what I always did, scanned the ground around camp out of habit, the way you check your surroundings before you're even fully awake. That's when I saw them. Large prints, coming out of the trees to the north, crossing the open ground toward camp, and stopping. Just stopping, about 8 feet from where we'd been sleeping. I stood there for a moment without moving. My first response wasn't fear. It was professional confusion. I walked over and crouched down and looked at them properly, and the confusion deepened with every second. The print shape was wrong. Not wrong like an unfamiliar animal, wrong like something that didn't quite commit to being what it was trying to look like. The dimensions suggested something very large and bipedal, but the stride pattern wasn't human, and the depth in certain spots was inconsistent in a way that didn't correspond to any gait I'd ever seen. No claw marks, no drag. The edges were clean. And there was no return trail. Whatever had made these prints had walked out of the tree line, crossed to the edge of our camp, and stopped. And then it was simply gone. Not gone like it jumped, not gone like it walked back the way it came. The trail ended, and there was undisturbed snow in every direction beyond that final print. I checked. I walked a full circle at increasing radius. Nothing. I should tell you that I stood there for a while before I woke my nephew. I wanted to look at it longer. Part of me was still trying to find the explanation, the angle I hadn't checked, the adjacent track I'd missed. I didn't find one. What I found was exactly what it appeared to be, and what it appeared to be had no rational account. My nephew looked at the tracks and asked me what made them. I told him I didn't know. He asked if we should follow the trail back to the trees. I told him no.
He looked at me. He was young enough that he expected me to have an answer to everything outdoors, and he could see that I didn't have one, and he went quiet. We made breakfast without talking much. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a camp when something feels wrong. It's not a comfortable quiet. It's the quiet of two people listening without wanting to admit they're listening. Now, here is where I need to tell you something that I was taught, and that I didn't fully understand until I was standing in that snow. My grandfather had talked to me, twice in my life, about certain things that lived at the outer edge of what he called the known world. He wasn't a dramatic man. He didn't tell stories to entertain. When he sat you down and spoke about something carefully, you understood that you were receiving information, not a performance. The first time he told me was when I was maybe 15. He didn't describe these things in detail. He was deliberate about that. He said, "There are presences in the deep wilderness that do not belong to the natural order. They are not animals. They are not spirits in the way we usually use that word. They exist at a threshold between what is physical and what is not, and because of that, the normal rules of engagement do not apply to them." He said, "You do not follow them. You do not investigate them. You do not speak their name, because they have ears for their name the way no animal does. And if you find evidence that one has been near, you leave. Not the next morning, not after you finish what you came to do. You leave." At 15, I absorbed this the way teenagers absorb things they don't think will ever be relevant, with one layer of attention. I filed it and moved on. Standing over those tracks in my 30s, I heard every word of it again like it had been said 30 seconds ago. I didn't tell my nephew any of this, not yet. I wanted to observe first. I wanted to be sure.
I wish I'd listened to my grandfather instead. The second morning, I came out of the tent and the tracks were back. Same entry point, same path. But they'd moved closer. The previous morning, they'd stopped at 8 feet. Now they stopped at 4, maybe 3.5. That close, they were right at the edge of the tent's shadow. Whatever had made them had stood there, in the night, in a cold that would have been hostile to most living things, close enough that if I'd unzipped the tent door, I could have reached it. I hadn't heard a sound. I stood in front of those tracks for a long time. There was a quality to the stillness around them that I can't explain in terms that will satisfy someone who's never felt it. Not silence exactly, more like pressure. Like the air in that specific location was different from the air 2 feet away. My nephew came out and stood next to me, and we both looked at them without speaking. Then he said quietly, "They weren't this close yesterday." "No," I said, "they weren't." We stood there. And that's when it started. The track closest to us, the final one, the leading edge of the trail, faded. Not melted. I want to be precise about this because it matters. Snow melts from the edges in and loses definition. This didn't lose definition. It simply became less there. And then it wasn't there. The snow in that location was undisturbed, as if the print had never been pressed into it. Smooth, unbroken. I looked at my nephew. He was staring at the ground with an expression I'd never seen on his face. Then the next one went. Same process. No gradual change, no visible mechanism. One moment present, the next moment gone. the snow beneath returning to its original untouched surface. And it was moving away from us. The prints were disappearing in sequence, tracking back the direction they'd come from, back toward the tree line. One, then the next, then the next. My nephew said my name. I told him not to move. I don't know why I said that.
I don't know what instinct produced it, but I felt with complete clarity that movement would be the wrong thing right now. We stood still, and we watched the trail erase itself. It took perhaps 2 minutes, maybe less. The prints disappeared one by one, moving away from us across the snow, retreating toward the trees, until there was only one left, the first one, the farthest from camp, at the edge of the tree line where the trail had begun. That one held for a moment. Then it was gone, and the snow was unbroken from our feet to the trees, as if nothing had ever crossed it. My nephew turned to me and said, "What was that?" I told him I needed to think. That was not an honest answer. I knew what that was. Or rather, I knew what my grandfather would have said it was. I just wasn't ready to say it in the middle of the wilderness with my nephew looking at me like that. There's a concept that the elders spoke about only in careful terms, never directly, and never with the full account given to anyone who wasn't ready for it. My grandfather's word for it translated roughly to something like, the ones who reclaim. Not a name. He was clear that the name was not to be used. A description of behavior. Because that was what defined them, he said. Not appearance, not habitat, behavior. They do not want to be tracked. More precisely, they can tolerate being seen. They can tolerate proximity. What they cannot tolerate, what triggers something in them, is comprehension. The moment a human being shifts from seeing to understanding, from noticing to decoding, something changes in the encounter. They know. He didn't know how they knew. He suspected it had something to do with attention, with the specific quality of focused human observation. But the result was always the same. They took back the evidence, not as a conscious performance, not to confuse, but as a reflex, the same way a living thing recoils when touched unexpectedly.
They felt the attention land on them through their tracks, and they pulled the tracks back, recalled them, like calling back a hand they'd extended too far. My grandfather said, "This is why you leave when you find the sign. Not because they will hurt you, not necessarily, but because the moment you start examining what they've left, they know your face, they know your attention. They have received something from you, the specific texture of your awareness, and that cannot be given back." He said, "Once it has your attention in return, it does not always leave." I thought about that while we packed up the camp in silence. My nephew asked only one question during the hour it took us to break everything down. He asked if whatever it was still there, in the trees. I said, "Probably." He thought about that. Then he said, "Is it watching us?" I said, "Yes, I think so." He didn't ask anything else. The drive back was quiet for the first hour. When my nephew finally spoke, he asked if I'd known something like this was possible. I told him my grandfather had warned me. He asked why I hadn't said anything. I told him I'd thought I would recognize the sign in time to react properly. He asked if we had. I said, "Probably not." Back in the village, I did something I'd never done before. I went to see the oldest woman in the community. She was in her late 80s by then, a woman who had grown up in a generation where this knowledge was still actively maintained. I told her what we'd seen, the full account. She listened without interrupting, which I noticed, because she was someone who usually had a comment for everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Did you study the tracks?" I said yes. She asked, "For how long?" I said, "Probably 15-20 minutes, the first morning." She nodded slowly. That night she came to where I was staying and burned something outside the door. I didn't ask what. She stayed out there for some time.
When she came back in, she sat down and looked at me and said, in a tone that was very calm and very serious, "It already knows your face. It knew it the moment you crouched down and started reading." She said, "You gave it your attention, and attention runs both ways." I asked her what that meant, what it would do with that. She said, "Probably nothing. These things are not hunters in the way we usually mean." But she said, "It knows you now. the way you might know a face you saw once, briefly, in a crowd. It won't forget. And if you go back to that territory, she said, don't look at the ground. I have not been back to that area since. I'm in my 80s now. My nephew has children of his own, children who have grown up and started going into the wilderness without always knowing what their great-great-grandfather knew. That's what breaks the chain. Not malice, not disrespect. Just time and the things that get lost in it. So here is what I want you to take from this account. Not the fear of it, though the fear is appropriate. The information. If you are in the deep wilderness, particularly in the north, particularly in winter, and you find tracks that have no return trail, stop. Do not crouch down. Do not study them. Do not try to identify what made them, and do not call someone else over to look, because the looking is the trigger. The comprehension is what they respond to. You can see them and be safe. The moment you begin to understand what you're seeing, the transaction has already happened. Leave the camp. Leave the area. Do not go back the next morning to check whether the tracks are still there, because they won't be, and the absence of them is not a relief. It is a confirmation. The ground, I told you at the start, doesn't lie. What I've had to revise is this. The ground can be edited. There are things that walk through this world and leave their mark in it, and then decide at the exact moment they feel themselves understood to take that mark back.
The ground doesn't lie, but something out there knows how to make it. I check the ground every morning, habit of a lifetime. But now there's a second habit layered underneath it, a half-second pause before I really look at anything unfamiliar. A breath, a moment where I decide whether I actually want to know what I'm looking at. Most mornings, nothing. Most mornings, the ground is just ground, and the tracks in it belong to things with simple explanations. But some mornings, I see something at the edge of understanding, and I make a choice. I look away, and I go back inside.